The bolt clicked forward at 0534 hours, and Private First Class Danny Reese chambered the first round of the day into his M1 Garand with a sound that had become more familiar than his own heartbeat. The rifle sat heavy across his knees as he crouched in the foxhole on Guadalcanal's jungle edge, the weight distributed differently than the Springfield he'd trained with at Camp Pendleton, heavier by a pound, balanced forward where the gas system and operating rod added mass to the barrel assembly. But that extra pound bought him something the Springfield couldn't deliver: 8 rounds of 30-06 ammunition fired as fast as he could pull the trigger, no bolt to work between shots, no fumbling with stripper clips while someone was shooting back. The jungle in front of him was still dark, the sun not yet clearing the ridgeline to the east, just the faintest grey light filtering through the canopy of trees and vines that grew so thick you couldn't see 30 feet in any direction. The air smelled of rotting vegetation and the peculiar sweetness of tropical flowers mixed with the sharper scent of insect repellent that every Marine had smeared on exposed skin before dark. Mosquitoes still hummed in clouds despite the repellent, and Reese's neck itched where something had bitten him during the night. Beside him in the foxhole, Corporal Jack Martinez was cleaning his Garand for the 3rd time since midnight, running a patch through the bore, with movements so practiced he didn't need light to do it properly. Martinez had been in the first wave at Tulagi, had fought through 3 months of jungle warfare, and treated his rifle with a respect that bordered on reverence. "You ever fire a Jap rifle?" Martinez asked quietly, his voice barely carrying over the ambient jungle noise. Birds beginning their morning calls, insects chirping, distant surf against the beach 200 yards behind their position. "No. Why would I?" "Picked one up after that fight at the Tanaru. Arisaka Type 99. Good rifle, well made, accurate. But it's bolt action. 5 rounds in an internal magazine. You work the bolt after every shot, eject the spent case, chamber a new round. Takes maybe 2 seconds if you're good, maybe 3 under stress." Reese had heard this lecture before, but Martinez liked to repeat it, liked to remind new Marines why their Garands mattered. "And we can fire 8 rounds in the same time. 8 rounds semi-automatic. Pull the trigger 8 times, get 8 shots. The Japs have to work their bolts 7 times to fire 8 rounds. In a firefight, that matters. That's the difference between putting rounds downrange when you need them and getting killed while you're working your bolt." The demonstration had been drilled into every Marine during training. One rifleman with an M1 Garand could maintain the same volume of fire as 3 riflemen with bolt-action rifles. The mathematics were simple and brutal. In a squad-level engagement, American Marines could put out 3 times the firepower of an equivalent Japanese infantry unit. Not because they were better shots or braver men, but because their rifles were simply superior designs. "Movement!" someone hissed from the foxhole to their left. 50 yards, bearing 030. Reese brought his Garand up to his shoulder, sighting down the barrel into darkness that was slowly resolving into shapes: trees, vines, shadows that might be men or might be jungle playing tricks on tired eyes. His thumb rested on the safety, his finger outside the trigger guard, until he had a target. The rifle felt solid against his shoulder, the stock worn smooth by use, the metal cool despite the tropical heat that would arrive with the sun. The Japanese came at 0547 hours, not the banzai charge that stories back home made them famous for, but a coordinated infantry attack, 3 squads moving through the jungle in loose formation, using cover, advancing by fire and maneuver, professional soldiers doing professional work, trying to dislodge the American perimeter from positions they'd held for 2 weeks. The first shots came from Japanese positions Reese couldn't see, the flat crack of Arisaka rifles, distinctly different from American weapons, higher pitched and sharper. Rounds snapped through the air overhead, cutting leaves, thudding into tree trunks. Reese pressed himself into the bottom of the foxhole, dirt against his face, his Garand held close. "Wait for it," Martinez said, his voice calm despite bullets cracking past. "Let them get closer. Make the first shots count." The Japanese were good. They moved in short rushes, 2 men covering while one advanced, using the jungle terrain to mask their approach. But the jungle worked both ways. Their muzzle flashes were visible in the pre-dawn gloom, and the Americans had been in position for hours, knew every approach route, had fields of fire planned and registered. "Fire!" someone yelled. Lieutenant Dyson, the platoon commander, his voice carrying down the line. Rees acquired a target 30 yards out, a Japanese soldier rising from behind a fallen log, his Arisaka coming up to aim. Rees fired. The M1 bucked against his shoulder, the recoil sharp but manageable, the gas system cycling the action automatically. The Japanese soldier went down. Rees shifted aim, fired again at another target, and again, and again. 8 shots in maybe 6 seconds, the distinctive ping of the empty N-block clip ejecting, his hands automatically pulling a fresh clip from his cartridge belt and thumbing it into the receiver. The clip seated with a metallic click, and the bolt slammed forward, chambering around, ready to fire again in less than 3 seconds. Around him, the entire American line opened up. 30 M1 Garands firing in a sustained fusillade that turned the jungle into a storm of steel. The volume of fire was tremendous, overwhelming, each Marine able to maintain fire at a rate the Japanese couldn't match. The attackers tried to return fire, but were pinned by the sheer weight of incoming rounds, forced to take cover, unable to advance or effectively fight back. Rees saw a Japanese soldier trying to work his bolt, saw him chamber around and aim, saw Martinez's shot hit him in the chest before he could fire. Another soldier rose to throw a grenade, was hit by 3 rounds from different riflemen before the grenade left his hand. The explosive detonated in the Japanese position, the flash briefly illuminating men diving for cover. The attack broke after 4 minutes of sustained fire. The Japanese pulled back into the jungle, leaving bodies behind. Their attack stopped cold by firepower they couldn't overcome. Rees counted his ammunition. 2 clips left, 16 rounds. He'd fired 32 rounds in 4 minutes of combat. With a bolt-action Springfield, he might have fired 12 rounds in the same time. The mathematics of survival favoured the M1. "Cease fire," Lieutenant Dyson called. "Conserve ammunition. Stay alert." The jungle fell silent except for wounded men crying out in Japanese, their voices fading as they were dragged away by comrades. Rees's ears rang from the gunfire. His shoulder ached from recoil. His hands shook with adrenaline aftermath. But he was alive, his position held, and the Japanese attack had been repulsed with minimal American casualties. Martinez was grinning, his teeth white in the growing dawn light. "That's why we carry Garands. That's why we win firefights. Superior firepower, properly applied." But the fight wasn't over. It was never over on Guadalcanal, where Japanese forces contested every yard of ground, where reinforcements arrived nightly by destroyer, where the jungle itself seemed hostile to American presence. The regiment had been fighting for 2 months, taking casualties daily, losing men to combat and disease, and the grinding attrition of jungle warfare. Over the following week, Rees learned the rhythms of combat with the M1, the way it heated up after sustained fire, the importance of keeping the gas system clean in the humid jungle environment, the distinctive ping of the ejecting clip that became a source of debate among Marines. Some claimed the Japanese listened for that sound, knew when Americans were reloading. Others argued it didn't matter because they were reloading in 3 seconds anyway, faster than an enemy could exploit the gap. He learned to appreciate the weapon's reliability. Unlike the Springfield, which required manual operation that could be affected by mud or exhaustion or panic, the Garand operated automatically as long as you kept pulling the trigger. In close-quarters jungle fighting, that automatic operation meant the difference between multiple aimed shots and fumbling with a bolt while the enemy closed distance. On November 3rd, Rees's squad was assigned to a patrol, 12 Marines pushing into the jungle to locate Japanese positions and assess their strength. It was the kind of mission that made everyone nervous because you were leaving prepared defences and moving into terrain where the enemy had every advantage, familiarity with the ground, prepared ambush positions, and the patience to wait for targets to come to them. They moved in single file, Martinez on point, Rees in the middle of the column. The jungle was dense here, the vegetation so thick they had to hack through it with machetes, the noise of their movement impossible to conceal. Birds fled ahead of them. Insects fell silent. Every sense screamed that they were being watched. The ambush came at 13:47 hours in a small clearing where the jungle opened enough to allow 15 yards of visibility. The Japanese had positioned themselves in a horseshoe around the clearing, waited until most of the American patrol was in the kill zone, then opened fire from 3 directions simultaneously. The volume of incoming fire was intense, 30 or 40 Arisaka rifles firing from concealment, their muzzle flashes visible in the jungle shadows. The Marine walking point went down immediately, hit multiple times. 2 more men fell in the first seconds. Rees dove behind a fallen tree, his Garand pressed against his chest, bullets tearing the air where he'd been standing. "Return fire!" Sergeant Miller was screaming. "Suppress those positions!" Rees rolled to his left, brought his Garand up, fired at a muzzle flash 20 yards away, shifted aim, fired again. The M1's semi-automatic action let him put rounds on target as fast as he could aim, no pausing to work a bolt, no break in fire that would give the enemy a chance to shoot back unanswered. Around him, the surviving Marines were doing the same, their Garands creating a wall of outgoing fire that forced the Japanese to take cover. But they were outnumbered and surrounded, pinned in a kill zone with limited cover. The Japanese had the advantage of position and numbers. This should have been a massacre, except the Japanese were armed with bolt-action rifles. Rees watched a Japanese soldier rise to aim, saw him fire, saw him work his bolt to chamber another round, that 2-second pause where he was vulnerable. Rees fired 3 times during that 2-second window, forcing the soldier to take cover before he could fire again. Multiply that advantage across 12 Marines with Garands, and suddenly the firefight's dynamic changed. The Japanese couldn't maintain sustained fire. Every time they tried to aim and shoot, they had to work their bolts, and during that interval, American semi-automatic fire forced them down. The ambushers became the suppressed, pinned by firepower they couldn't match. The Marines used that advantage to maneuver, 2 men providing covering fire while others moved to better positions, leapfrogging backward toward a more defensible position. Rees emptied his Garand, heard the distinctive ping as the clip ejected, reloaded in 3 seconds, fired again. His shoulder was bruised from recoil, but his hands moved automatically, muscle memory taking over when conscious thought became too slow. Fire, shift aim, fire, shift aim, fire. The rhythm became hypnotic, all-consuming. They fought their way out of the ambush over 20 minutes of sustained combat. 4 Marines dead, 3 wounded, but 8 survived because their rifles could put out enough firepower to suppress a superior force. When they reached friendly lines and collapsed behind the perimeter, Rees counted his remaining ammunition. 2 clips. He'd fired 64 rounds in 20 minutes. With a bolt-action rifle, he might have fired 20 rounds, and he'd probably be dead. That night, sitting in his foxhole cleaning his Garand by moonlight, Martinez told him the story everyone had heard, but few believed. General Patton supposedly said the M1 Garand was the greatest battle implement ever devised. Most Marines figured that was typical Patton hyperbole. But after today, Rees wasn't so sure. "It's not just the rate of fire," Martinez explained, working a cleaning patch through his barrel. "It's what that rate of fire lets you do tactically. You can suppress enemy positions. You can maneuver under fire. You can win firefights you should lose because you can put more rounds downrange faster. That's not just good engineering. That's a game changer." The campaign for Guadalcanal continued into December. Rees's regiment fought at Bloody Ridge, where Marine positions held against repeated Japanese attacks, the M1 Garands creating fields of fire that broke charge after charge. They fought in the jungle interior, where close-quarters combat favored automatic weapons over bolt actions. They fought along the coast, where Japanese reinforcement attempts ran into defensive fire that seemed impossible for the number of defenders. In every engagement, the M1 made the difference. Not because it was perfect. It was heavy, required maintenance, could malfunction if the gas system fouled. but because in the moment of combat, when everything happened too fast for conscious thought, it kept firing as long as you kept pulling the trigger. That automatic operation, that removal of one mechanical step from the firing cycle, translated into sustained firepower that Japanese bolt-action rifles couldn't match. Rees learned to recognize the sound of Arisaka fire, that sharp crack that was distinctive from American weapons. He learned that Japanese soldiers were well-trained, disciplined, willing to fight to the death for objectives Americans would have abandoned. Their tactics were sound, their marksmanship good, their courage unquestionable. But their rifles were a generation behind American designs, and in infantry combat, that generation gap mattered more than tactics or courage or determination. By January 1943, Japanese forces were evacuating Guadalcanal, their position untenable after months of attrition they couldn't replace. The Marines had won, though the cost had been heavy, over 1,000 dead, thousands more wounded or sick with tropical diseases. But they'd won in part because every Marine rifleman could maintain fire at a rate Japanese infantry couldn't match, superior firepower, properly applied, as Martinez liked to say. Rees rotated off Guadalcanal in February, was sent to Australia for rest and refit. He carried his Garand with him, the rifle that had kept him alive through 4 months of combat, that had become as familiar as his own hands. When he finally cleaned it properly, stripping it completely, inspecting every part, he found it was still in good condition despite the abuse of jungle warfare. The design was robust, reliable, built for soldier use, under the worst possible conditions. He thought about the Japanese soldiers he'd killed, wondered about them sometimes in quiet moments. They'd been brave men, professional soldiers, fighting for their country just as he fought for his. They'd died, not because they were inferior soldiers, but because they'd been issued inferior weapons, because Japanese military doctrine still favored bolt-action rifles that were accurate and reliable, but too slow for modern warfare's brutal pace. The M1 Garand remained standard issue for US forces through the rest of the war. Over 4 million were produced, equipping not just the Marine Corps but the Army, Navy and Allied forces. It fought in every theatre: Europe, Pacific, North Africa, Italy. It earned a reputation as one of the finest military rifles ever designed, combining semi-automatic fire with reliability and accuracy that bolt-action rifles couldn't match. But Rees never forgot that the rifle was just a tool. What mattered was the man using it, the training that made operation automatic, the discipline to maintain it properly, the judgment to use it effectively. The M1 gave American forces an advantage, but advantages meant nothing if soldiers didn't exploit them correctly. He fought through the rest of the Pacific campaign, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, always with an M1, always grateful for its semi-automatic action when bullets were flying. He survived the war, came home in 1945, and hung his Garand on the wall of his study where he could see it from his desk, a reminder of the men who'd designed it, the men who'd carried it, the men who'd died despite its advantages. The war taught him that technology mattered, that superior equipment gave soldiers a fighting chance, that engineering could mean the difference between victory and defeat. But it also taught him that wars weren't won by weapons alone. They were won by men who used those weapons, who endured hardship and fear and the grinding attrition of combat until one side could endure no longer. The M1 Garand was a superior rifle. That was simply fact, supported by data and combat experience, and the testimony of men who'd carried it in battle. But calling it superior carried implications that American soldiers won firefights because of equipment advantage rather than courage or skill or determination. The truth was more complex. They won because they had good equipment and good training and good leadership and the industrial capacity to support forces in combat for years if necessary. Japanese soldiers armed with Arisakas were formidable opponents who inflicted heavy casualties despite their inferior weapons. They fought with courage and skill and determination, making the Americans pay for every yard of ground. But courage and skill couldn't overcome a 3-to-1 disadvantage in sustained firepower. In infantry combat, when everything else was equal, the side that could put more rounds down range faster usually won. That was the brutal mathematics of modern warfare, and the M1 Garand embodied that mathematics in 8 pounds of wood and steel. Rees died in 1994, 70 years old, survived by his wife and 3 children who'd grown up hearing occasional stories about the war, but never the full truth. How could he explain what combat felt like, what it meant to kill men you didn't hate, what it cost to survive when friends died beside you? The words didn't exist for that kind of explanation. They found his Garand when they cleaned out his study, still hanging on the wall where he'd placed it 50 years earlier. The rifle was in perfect condition, cleaned and oiled, the metal gleaming, the wood glowing with careful maintenance. Attached to the trigger guard was a small tag with 8 names written in faded ink, the men from his squad who hadn't come home, whose memory he'd carried for half a century. His son took the rifle to a military museum, where it was displayed with other World War II artifacts. The placard beside it read, M1 Garand rifle, semi-automatic, .30-06 caliber, standard issue US military, 1936-1957, carried by PFC Daniel Rees, USMC, Guadalcanal campaign, 1942-43. The rifle stood silent in its display case, just one of millions produced, just one of thousands that saw combat. But to the men who'd carried Garands in battle, who'd relied on their semi-automatic action in firefights that determined whether they lived or died, the rifles were more than equipment. They were survival tools, carefully maintained and deeply trusted, the mechanical advantage that tilted odds toward friendly forces. On the island of Guadalcanal, rusting in jungle that has reclaimed much of the battlefield, lie the remains of weapons from both sides. Arisaka rifles with their bolts corroded shut, M1 Garands with their gas systems frozen by decades of tropical weather. The jungle doesn't distinguish between victor and vanquished, between superior and inferior designs. It simply reclaims everything, slowly and completely, until only memories remain. And in those memories, carried by aging veterans and their families, lives the truth that no museum display can fully capture, that wars are fought by human beings using tools their nations provide, and the quality of those tools matters more than anyone likes to admit. The M1 Garand was a superior rifle not because Americans were superior soldiers, but because American industry and engineering created a weapon that gave its users a tactical advantage in the brutal calculus of infantry combat. That advantage saved lives. American lives, certainly, but also shortened battles and ended the war sooner, which ultimately saved lives on both sides. The M1 didn't make war noble or just or anything except slightly more survivable for the men who carried it. That was enough. That had to be enough. The rifle kept its secrets, as all weapons do. Silent steel and wood, holding memories it cannot share, carrying weight it cannot feel, standing testament to human ingenuity applied to human destruction. And somewhere in that paradox lies all of warfare's truth, that we build tools to kill each other more efficiently and call it progress.